One of the most important things when you start to tie flies is to lay a good thread foundation. And I've seen this, I don't know how many times, in many flies, where thread wraps are not laid down on the hook next to each other, and that causes a fly to unravel or to fall apart when you cast it. And again, this is just a tip for the beginners, and quite an important one, I'd say, because everything starts with a good foundation. I've got a piece of Dacron here, and I'm going to just demonstrate with the Dacron the way I do it and the way I suggest you do it. When you start a fly, you trap the thread with wraps, and you wrap it backwards towards the bend of the hook to cover the hook shank. Let me just do that again. I'm just doing it with my hand, I don't have it in a bobbin. It's a little bit different. You cut the tag end, and you keep wrapping to the back until you start to put the first material on the tail or whatever that may be. Now, if the wraps are right next to each other and nice and tight, you don't even need a varnish to hold it onto the hook, because nothing will pull those fibers or those thread wraps out of position. Backwards or forward, they are well secured. What I've seen often happen is, and it doesn't matter whether you use a thin thread or thick thread, because the thinner the thread, if you use a smaller hook and you use a thinner thread, the same principle applies. You don't want thread wraps that are loose or that are across each other. You want a neat base. You don't want loose thread wraps that cross each other. That bulks up the hook very quickly. Every time you tie material in, every time you tie thread onto a hook, make sure the thread wraps every wrap is in place where it's supposed to be, and don't make unnecessary wraps to bulk up the hook. Now, if you don't put the thread wraps next to each other, and I'll demonstrate it with a normal thread. Let's say there's gaps in between the wraps. I'll just cut that piece of the tag end off. Let's say that happens. There's open wraps. And you start to tie materials. Look what happens. Those wraps are not secure. Everything can slide off. Make sure that those wraps are right next to each other. Now, I'm going to use a normal, on this hook, a 6/0 thread, and show you that exactly the same happens with the 6/0 thread on a hook. I'm going to start with thread wraps next to each other. And cut that tag end off. Now, if you want to try and move that, they can't move because they're next to each other. The one bumps into the other, and they hold them. They're held in place. Now, if I take the same thread, and I'm using a big hook here because I use the Dacron, it applies to. It doesn't matter what hook you use. It's the same principle applies. Secure that onto the hook. And now I want to cover the hook shank very quickly with thread because I've got a lot of shank to cover. You don't cover a hook shank like that very quickly with thread. You are going to lay a very weak foundation for your fly if you keep doing that, because this is going to happen. So, to get back to the thread wraps, a proper layer of thread, if you want a stronger fly, make sure those thread wraps are laid down right next to each other, even if it takes a bit longer. And thread wraps, covering a hook like that with a lot of layers of thread, just bulks up the fly eventually. And it's going to cause the tail to sit skew, or a wing not to be in place, or an abdomen that's not in shaped or a profile that's not going to be right. And it doesn't matter whether it's a trout fly, a saltwater fly, a bass fly, whatever fly. Make sure your thread foundation is strong and those wraps are next to each other. I hope this helped. Watch our channel, like our channel, check out our other tips, and please follow it. Thanks.